Hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining. We'll give it just one more minute before we get started to give people a little extra time to log in. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's session on the SBA Shuttered Venue Operators Grants Program. During today's session, panelists will share some background on the program, including eligibility requirements, as well as share tips on how businesses can better prepare to submit their application. In just a moment, we'll begin the presentation, but we wanted to first mention a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. Everyone is muted and will remain muted throughout the duration of the webinar, but you can use the chat and Q&A boxes to submit any questions or comments. We will be reserving some time at the end to monitor those questions, but feel free to submit throughout the presentation as we'll be looking through them for that Q&A portion at the end. So feel free to submit at any point. If you have to leave early or you'd like to share the event recording with everyone, we will be posting the recording, the deck, and other materials on LISC.org after the event has concluded. So please be on the lookout for an email with a link to that page after the session has ended. Unfortunately, we are unable to respond to individual eligibility questions during today's session and encourage those with specific eligibility questions to contact their local business development organizations and SBA resource providers. With that said, I'll hand things over to Bill Taft, LISC Senior Vice President of Economic Development, to begin the webinar.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks everyone for joining us today. LISC is putting on this webinar with one major goal, and that is to make sure that there is access to good information on the SVOG, or Shuttered Venue Operators Grant Program of the SBA in our network and beyond. And LISC is a national community development nonprofit organization that is really focused on a wide range of efforts to partner with local communities to improve quality of life, and with a real emphasis on equity in that work. And so we really want to make sure that this particular program, which is so important for operators that have been impacted by the pandemic, is truly well known, and there's good information available in communities that are historically disinvested communities especially, and also with businesses that are historically disadvantaged. So thank you for joining. That's our goal today. We have several different presenters today that are going to help us with that. One thing I do want to make sure I point out is that LISC is not affiliated with the Small Business Administration or the SBA. And so we want to make sure that this is not what the information we provide is to the best of our knowledge, but we are not the authorities. We are not the organization that makes decisions on eligibility. So we want to make sure that if you have questions that are specific, you should definitely refer to SBA Resources. We will make those available to you as we go through the program. I just want to make that disclaimer clear. We have done our best to understand the program and have folks on the panel that really have spent a lot of time thinking about that. But our goal really is just to make sure that we are getting the word out and also learning from some of our experiences with previous programs like the PPP program and some of the barriers to businesses successfully applying there. We are assuming that most of the folks listening are operators of venues, but some of you are probably with nonprofits that are helping operators apply. And so we want to make sure that we talk about just some of those things that in the past was helpful in helping small businesses be ready to apply for relief funds when they became available in programs like PPP that we can learn from for this program. So I think at this point, I just wanted to say a little bit more about LISC, and then I will hand it over to our first speaker and introduce the rest of them as well. So LISC is, we work with residents and partners, and so this is very much focused on, we work with grassroots organizations and individuals to forge resilient, inclusive communities of opportunity across America. Great places to live, work, visit, and do business and raise families. As I said, we're a nonprofit organization. We've since the pandemic hit, we've done a lot of work directly supporting entrepreneurs, particularly entrepreneurs of color, in accessing resources, and we will continue to do that. If you keep an eye on our organization over the next months as other resources become available, whether those are local or national or state, we will try to push this information. So the way you heard about this today, keep an eye on that beyond this webinar and look for other resources as they become available as well. So we have three presenters on this panel today. We are really kind of giving three different angles on this opportunity. So Michelle Harati is with LISC's National Public Policy team and really focuses on economic development, and she's going to go over and outline just the major features and eligibility criteria for the program. Sean Watterson is one of the founders of the National Independent Venue Association, or NIVA, which is really an exciting organization that sprang up by operators after the pandemic hit to advocate for these resources, and is now helping to get the word out about how to access that. And then finally, Karleen Porcena, who is a program officer with my team, the economic development team for LISC, and really is the person on our team with a lot of expertise in how to support small businesses effectively. And we'll be talking about some of the lessons learned from PPP that can maybe be applied to getting ready for this opportunity as it opens up later this week and beyond. So I'm going to hand it over to Michelle to get us started in describing the program.
Thanks, Bill, and thank you all for joining today. I'm going to start us off with some background on the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant Program, which is otherwise known as SVOG or SVO grants. So the program was established late last year by the Economic Aid to Hard-Hit Small Businesses, Nonprofits, and Venues Act, and was recently amended by the American Rescue Plan Act, which was signed into law in mid-March. The aim of the program is to provide direct financial assistance to deliver relief to performance arts-related businesses that have been negatively impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. As Bill noted, the SVOG program will be administered directly by the Small Business Administration, or SBA, and entities that are deemed eligible for the program may receive financial assistance in the form of a grant. In total, $16.25 billion was made available for this program. It was originally appropriated at $15 billion, and the American Rescue Plan provided an additional $1.25 billion for the program, bringing the total to $16.25 billion, of which more than $16 billion is allocated directly for financial assistance grants. The Economic Aid Act also required that SBA establish a small business set-aside. The set-aside requires that SBA provide no less than $2 billion of the available funding to provide grants to entities with not more than 50 employees during the first 59 days of opening the program. Applications are not yet being accepted. However, entities may start completing their applications and submitting supporting documents to the SBA directly on April 8, 2021. The aim of this webinar is to provide businesses and organizations that serve those businesses with an overview of the program and best practices for accessing federal relief. For those who are looking for more detailed information on how to apply and applications directly with the SBA, they should refer to the SBA's recent webinar, which we'll provide a link to in the chat. So we're going to start off with some of the basic parameters. One of the key questions is who's eligible to apply for the program. So eligible entities are those listed here. This includes live venue operators or promoters, theatrical producers, live performing arts organization operators, relevant museum operators, zoos and aquariums who meet specific criteria, motion picture theater operators, talent representatives, and each business entity owned by an eligible entity that also meets the eligibility requirements. For those who are looking for complete definitions of these terms, you should refer to the Federal Register notice and reviewing the SBA's eligibility overview sheet, which we'll also provide links to in the chat. And as Sarah noted, we will be sharing these slides and resources afterwards, so you can look for more details within the SBA resources directly. Another key eligibility requirement is that entities must have been in operation as of February 29th, 2020. And you must also have documentation that establishes the date of operations beginning. And this can include articles of incorporation, tax returns, financial information, or other documents that establish that the entity was in operation as of February 29th, 2020. It's also important to note that the SVOG program interacts with the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP. As you may be aware, entities were originally prohibited from receiving an SVOG grant if they had already received a first or second draw PPP loan on or after December 27, 2020. The American Rescue Plan Act, which became law on March 11th, removed this restriction by allowing entities to also apply for SVOG even if they had received a PPP first or second draw loan prior to receiving the SVOG grant. So as of now, under the current law, entities who received a PPP loan on or after December 27, 2020 will now have their SVOG awarded amount reduced by their PPP loan amount. So what this means is there's no longer an automatic bar, but if you are approved for an SVOG grant and you also received a PPP loan after December 27, 2020, your SVOG grant amount will be reduced by the amount of your PPP loan. It's also important to note that entities will become ineligible for future PPP loans after receiving an SVOG. You can also apply for an SVOG and an economic injury disaster loan, or EIDL, from the SBA, but you cannot use the SVOG for the same purposes and costs that are covered by an EIDL loan. For more information, we encourage you to review the SBA's cross-program eligibility chart, which we will provide a link to. The program is restricted to eligible entities. In terms of ineligible entities, those include those not listed as eligible entities, and there also may be instances when someone would otherwise be eligible, but could be deemed ineligible by the SBA. The reasons for ineligibility include, but are not limited to those that are listed here. To highlight a few, those that were not in operation as of February 29, 2020, entities who had more than 10% of their 2019 gross revenue come from the federal government. Note, this does not include disaster assistance. Entities who meet all three of these qualifications. If an entity owns or operates entities in more than one country and in more than 10 states, and had more than 500 employees as of February 29, 2020. And again, all three of those would need to be true for an entity to be deemed ineligible under this reason. Other reasons for ineligibility could include if a business is not located in the US, they do not primarily operate within the US, or if they do not make a significant contribution to the US economy through payment of taxes or use of American products, materials, or labor. Also, entities that are publicly traded corporations or are majority owned and controlled by a publicly traded corporation, or present live performances or sell products or services of a prurient sexual nature will be deemed ineligible. Now, moving on to the award amount. Grant amounts are going to be calculated based on when an eligible entity began operation. So grant amounts will reflect one of two instances. For entities that were in operation on January 1st, 2019, grants will be for an amount equal to 45% of their 2019 gross earned revenue, or $10 million, whichever is less. For entities that began operation after January 1st, 2019, grants will be for the average monthly gross earned revenue for each full month they were in operation during 2019 multiplied by 6 or 10 million, whichever is less. In either case, the maximum award amount is $10 million, and SBA estimates that 15,000 total awards will be made with an average award amount of $1 million. So within the SVOG program, the authorizing legislation established funding priorities for SBA in terms of administering the grants. There are 3 priority periods for this program. The first priority will be within the first 14 days of grant awards. This period is reserved for entities that suffered a 90% or greater revenue loss between April and December 2020 as compared to the same period in 2019. This will be followed by the second priority phase, which will be the next 14 days of grant awards. This is reserved for entities that suffered a 70% or greater revenue loss between April and December 2020 as compared to the same period in 2019. And finally, the third priority period will be 28 days after first priority awards are made. This priority period will be reserved for entities that suffered a 25% or greater earned revenue loss between one quarter in 2019 and the corresponding quarter in 2020. It's important to note that in the event of overwhelming demand, any applicants that met the 90% or greater threshold or the 70% or greater threshold, but that were not awarded in their priority periods will be considered by SBA in the following priority periods. Also, during the third priority period, which considers quarterly gross earned revenue decline, the applicant may choose the quarter, but it must be the same quarter for both 2020 and 2019 that they are comparing. It's also important to note that SBA is utilizing 2 primary revenue definitions. The first and second priorities will be for those entities based on gross revenue declines. Gross revenue includes all revenue in whatever form from whatever source. This includes contributions, donations, and grants, except it does not include federal disaster assistance. The third priority will be based on earned revenue, and earned revenue is restricted to monies received from the sales of goods and services. Earned revenue excludes other funds such as donations, sponsorships, government assistance, or investment returns. There's also the potential for supplemental funding. In the event that funding remains after all 3 priority periods have passed, SBA will proceed with supplemental awards. Supplemental awards will be awarded through a separate application phase to entities that received funding during the first 3 priority periods and suffered a 70% or greater revenue loss for the most recent calendar quarter. If all funding is expended, the SBA intends to issue $0 placeholder awards in the event that Congress appropriates additional funds for the program. Further details are expected, and entities may not apply for supplemental funds at this time. So in terms of application preparation, to successfully apply for SVOG, potential applicants should confirm that they're eligible, sign up for updates at the SVO grant portal website, which we'll put the link to in the chat. They should read the SBA's FAQs and review SBA's application checklist for the required forms and documents and begin compiling necessary information and supporting documentation. It's also important to note that to submit an application, you must register in the System for Award Management, or SAM, at sam.gov. This is not an automatic process, and if you are not registered, you should begin this process now, as it can take up to 7 days. It's also important to note that in order to register for SAM, you will need to enter your DUNS number. And if you do not have a DUNS number, you can obtain one for free from dnb.com. And this will likely also take 3 to 7 days to obtain. We've put links to both of those websites in the chat as well. So in terms of application processing, you can apply at the SBA's exclusive website, the link to which is provided in the chat. Applications will begin to be accepted beginning on April 8th, 2021. To do so, you will need to create an account within the application portal, enter all the required information and respond to questions posed, upload all required supporting documents, and ensure that your application and the documentation provided is complete and correct. It's important to note that SBA does not expect to have the capacity to have a back and forth. So you'll want to make sure that your applications are fully completed prior to submitting. And SBA will not consider the application to be received until it's been fully submitted. And that is when it will review. You can save an application in process to return to it if you need to take time to gather additional documentation. You can also visit the portal now to familiarize yourself and review consolidated SVOG information that the SBA has provided, such as application checklists, FAQs, and video tutorials on how to obtain a DUNS and SAM registration. Applications will be accepted on a rolling basis, and they will be accepted until funds are exhausted. Even though there are priority periods, you can apply at any time, and SBA will place applications within their appropriate priority based on revenue decline information. And within that priority, applicants will be served on a first-come, first-served basis. SBA has also provided a complete list of required documentation. This application checklist can help you to gather the information you will need to submit an application. This includes background and financial documents, standard forms, including certifications, and additional applicant-specific documents that are based on your venue type. We'll include a link to this as well in the chat. Entities must ensure that all forms are completed correctly and uploaded successfully, as errors and incomplete information will result in denial. You will also need to draft a certification of needs statement, of which SBA has provided examples. This certification of needs statement must include a good faith certification that the uncertainty of current economic conditions make the grant necessary to support ongoing operations, and state that the entity will either remain in operation or intends to reopen with an estimated date, and provide an assurance to the SBA that the entity was fully operational on February 29th, 2020. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sean, who will provide us with some venue-specific insights and background on the program.
Thanks, Michelle. And thank you to LISC for inviting me to participate in this. And to tie in the Q&A, I'm not avoiding your questions. I'm doing my best to answer as many questions as I can. This program came about through the work that the independent venues did to lobby Congress and the people who supported us. And I think one of the things to note is this organization of independent venues didn't exist a year ago. It is only something that came about in response to COVID. And it's pretty amazing in 1 year what was able to be done, but this is a pretty incredible year. For scale perspective, the total of $16.25 billion that is going to be administered through the SBA as part of the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant Program is almost 100 times the National Endowment for the Arts annual budget. So this is the biggest arts funding program in the history of Congress. So that's probably also why it's hard to have specific answers to some of the questions. The SBA has done as good a job as they can to try and address a lot of questions through the frequently asked questions that they have posted on their website. We were actually hoping for one more version of those FAQs to address some issues like the 4-wall rental venue issues that Ty has been asking about in the Q&A section, along with a user guide to help people understand how to fill out the application. That could drop any hour now, so I would encourage folks to stay abreast of the SBA's website and the information that they're putting out about this program. We do know that the program is going to open this Thursday, April 8th. We've been told that it will be done at a time that is accessible for people across the US, including Guam. So we're expecting that might mean a later afternoon opening rather than an early morning opening. And in terms of what we're doing as NIVA to try and prepare both our members and other venues and promoters who may not have joined NIVA yet or aren't even aware of NIVA yet, is to try and get information about this process out there through webinars like this program, and then also hooking folks up with service providers like the SBA's Small Business Development Corporation, SCORE, and Women's Business Center resources to help people get their finances in order for their application, and to help with specific eligibility questions about individual situations. So my guess is Q&A is probably more valuable than talking about the history of this program. So with that, I'm going to pass the conversation on to the next speaker and leave as much room as possible for Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Sean. I'll pass it over now to Karleen.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. Hi, I'm Karleen Porcena. I work with the National Economic Development Team at LISC and focus primarily on our small business efforts. I spent the majority of last year helping many small businesses in the Boston and Greater Boston area receive federal funding through PPP before rejoining our LISC team. So I'll keep my section brief because I know that people really want to get to the Q&A, but I did want to just share some quick tips geared towards organizations and service providers on ways you can be most helpful throughout this grant program from my experience and what we've learned through the PPP process last year. So the first essential piece, which probably comes at no surprise, is the importance of outreach and engagement. So programs and resources like this are only as good as the access strategies put into place in order to reach, customers and clients who really need it the most. As a service provider, you are truly the anchor, the pathway to ensure that there's an equitable access to these type of resources, especially when you're thinking of or working on resources from the federal government. As service providers, you also have the ability to leverage your networks, right? You all have the trust, you have the relationships with certain communities and networks on the ground. So using those networks is really key. Targeted outreach is going to be really important. So, whether it's ensuring that people from your advisory board are aware of this grant program, if you have an actual board that you're connecting with regularly, ensuring that they are directing people to you or other business serving organizations, bringing on local businesses who have strong influences and using them to help spread the word amongst networks is really key as well. The ability for a business to actually share their own experience with other businesses is extremely powerful because then you're able to kind of get the information from their own perspective. And then, with outreach being able to play a role in deciphering information. With federal grant programs, there's a lot of layers, there's a lot of updates that we've been seeing, and it's important to stay as up to date as possible in order to decipher what's fact and what's fiction. The ability to kind of synthesize complex information is critical, and we heard from Michelle earlier that there's so many different components with this program. It's not easy, right? The more comfortable the service providers are with the information, the more comfortable a business will be. And we know that it's really important to make sure that businesses do feel comfortable with the process, with their applications. and ensuring that you're connecting with partners like LISC, local business development organizations. Sean mentioned a couple as well, who have really taken the time to kind of digest the information, who have watched the videos from the SBA to share kind of insightful and helpful tips. Being able to walk through eligibility criteria. I know there's several questions on eligibility, so service providers will be really helpful with that. Looking at priority breakdowns, doing the calculations of how much a business can apply for, are all going to be really helpful, as most businesses don't have, tons of time to sit and walk through all of this information. So as kind of digestible as you can make the information to your key businesses will be really important. And then lastly, there's a lot of paperwork, there's a lot of administration with these type of federal programs. So being able to anticipate beforehand what businesses may need will be really important. We know that in the past, when there's a lot of paperwork, many of the businesses that might need these resources don't have entire administration teams where they're able to collect this type of necessary paperwork quickly. And we also know that because this program is being administered directly through the SBA, unlike the PPP where you are working with different SBA approved lenders, the SBA doesn't have the same type of capacity to go back and forth when an application is not complete. So it's even more critical that service organizations are helping businesses early on, collecting the appropriate documents and getting them together. And I just wanted to re-emphasize a point that Michelle made earlier regarding incomplete applications. So what we've learned from the recent SBA website is that an incomplete application will be denied at this point. So we want to get the applications in early, but at this point, it's more important to ensure that your application is actually complete. So, assisting with collecting of documentation early on, making sure that you're not just kind of sending the checklist out, but you're really walking through it with people. It's 5 pages. Not all of the sections pertain to every applicant. Again, so making sure that you're holding webinars, whether it's for a specific group that's applying, and making sure that people really understand the necessary paperwork, holding office hours, and really kind of bringing that checklist to life is going to be what's most useful. And then encouraging businesses to also take the time to look around and familiarize themselves with the portal prior to submitting the application will be key. And I know there's a ton of businesses on this webinar, but there's also a lot of service organizations. We do want to say, thank you for your support. As you have seen firsthand how this pandemic has really been devastating to a lot of businesses. But we do know that you being here shows that there's that the importance of, getting the word out and making sure that everyone has equal access to this program is going to be really important. And you all are kind of the first line in being able to share this information. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Karleen. We also just wanted to share, and again, these resources will be made available in a follow-up email to everyone who's registered for the event. Some consolidated websites that will be helpful for you to visit if you're getting a sense of the program. Again, there's the SVOG application portal. Sean mentioned we do anticipate a user guide to the actual application process to be forthcoming. There's a link to the most recent version of the FAQ. And again, we do think that there might be an update forthcoming. So if there is an update between now and when we send out this follow-up information, we'll be sure to include the links to the most recent information. We also encourage you to review the eligibility requirements document that has information to make sure that your venue meets the specific needs for each type. So if you are, a movie theater versus if you are a live venue with music, you're going to have different requirements and different supporting documentation that you'll need to upload. So you want to be paying attention to that. Also a link to the checklist that we mentioned. And again, if you're looking for more details on the application and what you can expect if you are awarded in terms of the grant management and reporting, we encourage you to watch the SBA's informational webinar. And then also, if you're looking for more complete definitions and perhaps if you're one of the nonprofit service providers and you're looking for information on the program as a whole, you can take a look at the Federal Register notice on the program. And then just to note that SBA will not be providing direct assistance on the applications in order to maintain a fair and transparent process. But you can receive assistance through local business development organizations and SBA resource partners, like Sean mentioned. And there are direct links there and that we've included in the chat that you can find local service providers within your area to ask more of your specific eligibility questions too. So with that, we'll go ahead and go to the Q&A portion. And so one of the first questions, and if the other panelists want to turn their videos on while we do the Q&A portion, hopefully our bandwidth will support that, is in regards to the PPP and the overlap with SVOG and clarification on what the current standards are. And I'll take the first stab on it, and then if anyone else wants to chime in, feel free. So currently, how it's being administered is that if you do receive a first or second draw PPP loan, you can apply for the SVOG grant. What happens is if you are approved for an SVOG grant, whatever your grant amount is will be reduced by the amount of your PPP loan. So for example, if you were awarded a grant for SVOG of $500,000, but you received a PPP loan for $100,000 after December 27th of 2020, your grant amount would only be for $400,000. So you can do both, but if you are awarded for an SVOG grant amount, your amount that you are awarded will be deducted, the PPP loan amount will be deducted from that overall grant award amount. So hopefully that answers that. I don't know if anyone else wanted to chime in on that specific one.
The only thing I'd add, because you nailed it, is that the money that you get via the PPP is PPP money. And so whatever you need to do to get forgiveness for that PPP loan, you'll need to do with your lender. It won't be funds that get automatically treated as a grant as the SVOG funds. So just be aware if you are doing the PPP rules apply to the PPP funds.
Yes, that's a great point. They're separate processes. And so like Sean said, if you are getting a PPP loan or you received one prior to this grant, you'll need to pursue forgiveness through your lender separately from this grant process. Another question we've gotten is about EIDL loans and how those interact with SVOG. My understanding is that you can apply for both an SVOG and an EIDL loan. There's not a direct interaction. And again, we encourage you to refer to the SBA's cross-program eligibility checklist that they've created. But you cannot use it for duplicative purposes. So you have to make sure that your documentation, and in the event that you were audited in the future, you could show that they were used for unique expenses. Essentially, what you covered with your EIDL loan is distinct from what's covered by the SVOG grant.
And the only thing I'd add there is there is a question in the FAQs about using SVOG proceeds to repay EIDL loans. It's a bit confusing because the FAQ says that money can't be used to repay loans taken out after February of 2020, although in a separate part it says funds can be used to repay SBA loans it can be used to pay for regular interest and principal payments. So we've asked for some clarification there, whether people could make their regular payments on existing EIDL loans taken out after February 2020. We think it may be possible, but it doesn't sound like it's likely you could use the money to pay an EIDL loan off early.
Great, thank you for that clarification. Another question that we've got on this overlap is between SVOG and the new and forthcoming restaurant grant program. And so we will be doing a future webinar specific to the restaurant grant program. But just for everyone's awareness out there, the American Rescue Plan also included an appropriation of $28.6 billion to provide grants to businesses that are within the food and beverage industry and restaurants broadly, and how this interacts with the SVOG. My understanding is that for SVOG, it's either one or the other for the restaurant grant. So if you got a shuttered venues grant, you wouldn't be eligible for the restaurants grant, but you could apply for this grant. And if you were deemed ineligible, you could then apply for the restaurants grant if you met those eligibility requirements, but you wouldn't be able to double dip essentially. You couldn't get this grant and a restaurants grant. Is that your understanding as well, Sean?
Yes. There may be a draft of the restaurant grant program out there, and it may have a question saying if you have applied for or received an SVOG grant, you are ineligible. So it's not clear whether simply applying for an SVOG will make you ineligible for the restaurant grant program. Need clarity from SBA on that. But if you're more likely to apply for the restaurant fund, you may want to get an answer on that before making a decision about applying for an SVOG loan.
That's a great point. So yes, I think if you think that in terms of looking at the eligibility considerations, it might be more apparent that you're more readily a fit for a restaurants grant. We encourage you to reach out to your SBA resource providers, again, the SBDC networks and women business centers and veteran business centers, to ask those specific questions to make sure that you're applying for the program that fits your specific business needs the best. Another question that we had, and Karleen, this is probably for you, is in terms of if it's a nonprofit who's providing some of these services, if they can have some contact info to reach out to LISC staff directly to do some more coordination.
Yeah, I think we can definitely do that. I mean, we work with a number of SBOs or small business development organizations across the country. So we'll be happy to kind of loop you into an organization that's close to your region.
Great, thank you. We also had a question about if there was, that they had heard that there was the waiver for the SAM and DUNS requirement, and if this was true or not. My understanding is that the DUNS and SAMs requirement were waived for the restaurants grants program that is forthcoming, which has not been, we don't have a date yet or anything, but that the requirements for SAM and DUNS remain in place for the shuttered venues. Is that correct, Sean, your understanding as well?
Yes, as far as SVOG goes, they have not waived that requirement.
Great. We also got a question about what is a DUNS number. Essentially, a DUNS number is a free number you can get that's a unique identifier for you, primarily used in terms of contracting or receiving grants from the federal government. So it's one of the ways that the SBA is providing accountability and oversight of the program, is by requiring all of the potential applicants to obtain a DUNS number. And again, you can get that for free at the link we entered into the chat, and you will need your DUNS number to complete the other registration that is also required at sam.gov. We also got a question on the clarification of earned and gross revenue, and the distinction that SBA is making there. Let me see if I can go back to the slide there. So as we can see here, so SBA is going to be doing for the first and second priorities, the determinations will be based on gross revenue, and gross revenue is all revenue from whatever source. So primarily this is going to be the distinction between a nonprofit or a for-profit organization that we're talking about here when we're looking at these two conceptions of revenue. So the first and second will be for gross revenue, which includes sales and contributions. And then the third priority, though, will be restricted to just earned revenue, which is money received from the sale of goods and services. If no one has anything to add there, I'll go to the next question, which was a question regarding the priorities. And so again, the program will have 3 funding priorities, which means during these days, these timelines, they will be funding entities that fall within these guidelines. So the first 14 days will be for those who have had a 90% or greater revenue loss. Then the next priority period will be the subsequent 14 days, which will be the 70% or greater revenue loss. And then finally, the third priority will be for those who've had a 25% or greater earned revenue loss based on quarter comparisons. And again, if in the event that there's overwhelming demand, how SBA plans to deal with this is that if you applied and you fell within the first priority period, but they weren't able to make you an award for the first 14 days, then you would move to the front of the line for the second priority period. And within each of these priority periods, they will be making awards on a first come, first served basis. And so you can apply at any time once your application is complete and ready, but SBA will look at your revenue decline information, and based on that, they will place you within the appropriate priority period. Was there anything on that, Sean, or anyone else you guys want to add it on the priority periods?
Just the design is really to help those hardest hit. And the reason the focus is on gross revenue, not earned revenue, is because it's really not drawing a distinction between for-profits and not-for-profits. Not-for-profits that have experienced gross revenue loss, including donations, at a significant level, 70% or more, 90% or more, are equally eligible as small businesses that have experienced that kind of loss. So that's the reason for those priority periods, and hopefully, especially for the smallest of the applicants, that first 2-week priority period will be helpful in making sure that if it takes them a little bit longer to get their application together and in, they're still within that priority period.
Great, yeah, and that's a great point. And that's part of the reason that Congress also established the $2 billion set aside for the entities that have no more than 50 employees. So that's something else to keep in mind if you fall under that threshold. There was another question about waiting to submit in terms of when your priority period groups are. But again, to clarify, you should submit once your application is ready and you have all of the supporting documentation required, and SBA will place you in the appropriate priority group. So no need to wait to apply. Let's see. A number of questions here. Do we know if the priority periods, if the gross revenue excludes any CARES grants or other federal grants that they might have received?
Yes, it excludes disaster assistance, whether that's federal or state or local via CARES Act. But Great. It's not all disaster assistance. If somebody received a grant from a foundation or raised money through a GoFundMe or a Kickstarter, it's not clear that that qualifies as disaster assistance, and it would need to be counted as revenue.
Thank you. And again, that's why we encourage you all to make contact with the resource provider if you haven't already. They'll be much more adept at answering those specific individual questions. Someone asks, if they're denied, will they be able to reapply for the program? My understanding is no, but Sean, is that your understanding as well?
My understanding is if you are denied, there is no appeal. I don't know that the question has come up whether you could reapply, but based on the information about there not being appeals if you are rejected, I wouldn't hold out hope to reapply if you get rejected.
Thank you. Someone asked, what happens if the SBA runs out of money during the first priority period? My understanding is if they run out of money during the first priority period, they won't be able to make any subsequent grants unless Congress appropriates them additional funding. Is that your understanding as well, Sean?
Yeah, that's my understanding. Whether it's during the first priority period, the second, or the third period, if they run out of money during the initial grant period, Congress would need to approve additional funding. The only thing the SBA could do without additional funding, which they have suggested they might do, is issue what they're calling $0 supplemental grants to people who have received initial grants. Our understanding is that if they proceed with that supplemental $0 supplemental grant, it is both a placeholder in case Congress appropriates additional funds, but it also will likely allow for the use of initial grant funds beyond the December 31st, 2021 expense period, an additional 6 months. But until they announce that supplemental $0 program, the rules are the money is for use on expenses incurred through December 31st, 2021.
Great, thank you. And on that note, we had a question about the types of eligible expenses. We didn't include it in this presentation, but if you go to the SBA's main landing page for the Shuttered Venues program, there's a complete list of the eligible expenses, and by and large, it's more flexible than the PPP program, but it also includes the expenses that were included under the PPP program. Someone asked if this is different from the targeted EIDL advance. Yes, this is a different program from the EIDL advance, and again, you could apply for both, but you would need to use them for distinct purposes. The targeted EIDL advance is a grant for everyone's awareness. In terms of the type of documentation that they'll need, again, if you look at there's a number of questions there depending on the type of venue. If you look at the documentation checklist that SBA has provided, you can take a look at and see, depending on which category that you fall under. Again, are you a live venue? Are you a movie operator or others? And they will have a list of the different supplemental information that you will need to provide that's specific to your business type. So we encourage you to take a look at that because SBA is going to be the full authority on what are the documentation that they're looking for, because again, SBA is administering this program directly and it's their staff who are going to be making the eligibility determinations. So you want to make sure that everything that you are collecting aligns with what is in the checklist, so that when they are reviewing your application, you have all the information that is required to be approved. Someone's asking, and Sean, maybe you might have a little bit more insights on this, in terms of what are, the level of formality that's needed for the backup documentation in terms of performer contracts or vendor invoices. I'm not sure, maybe if there's how you've approached that for your own venue, or you've seen others.
Sure. We don't have answers, and I don't want to pretend to have answers on the level of specificity, but the approach I'm taking is a basic understanding that the SBA is going to hire an army of probably 500 people to review these applications as they come in. They are going to need to be able to check the box for each of the questions that you meet the basic criteria. They're not going to be doing forensic audits on every application that comes through. They just need to see that you really are a venue, that you operate as a venue, you market events, those sorts of things. So the
That's
guidance
helpful.
we can give, yeah, is basically make sure you're telling your story, make sure you're labeling your files correctly, make sure when you're submitting documentation, it's clear that you're submitting a document every time they ask you for a document. Telling folks don't submit one document and assume it answers all the questions. Make the reviewer's job as easy as possible to answer the question in the affirmative and move on to the next thing. But if you don't have something, you don't have something. You just have to be able to explain with as much clarity as you can what you do and why you think you are eligible.
Thank you, that's helpful. So in the last few minutes we have here, I'll try to take a few more questions. We had a question about if you start your application, but you don't hit the submit button and you need a return to come back and upload more documents, when are you considered to be in the queue? My understanding is that you are considered to be in the queue on the date that you actually hit submit. So if you save an application in process and you go and you're collecting more documentation, but you don't hit submit until a few days later, say on April 12th, you wouldn't be considered to have joined the queue until April 12th, the date that you've actually submitted the complete application. There's another question in terms of the certification of need and that estimation of a reopening date. And so if we have any thoughts on if someone doesn't expect to be able to reopen until 2022, if there's any term of a timeline that SBA is looking for in terms of the estimated reopening date. Do you have any thoughts on that, Sean?
That's a good question. I hadn't thought about reopening post 2021. I know that the certification of need is a pretty short certification, and they give an example of that on one of the slides in the SBA tutorial. So I would just copy and paste the language they've used, but I don't have an answer about if you don't think you're going to open in 2021.
Okay, perfect, thanks. Do we know the expenses that are eligible to be covered? Is it only those who were incurred in 2020, or does it also include those in 2021?
My understanding is that the SVOG grant can be used for expenses that aren't already covered, so no double dipping, from, I believe it's April 1st of 2020 through December 31st of 2021. So if you had expenses in 2020 post-COVID that aren't otherwise covered by a PPP and EIDL, other disaster relief funding you received, you could include that in the proposed budget and it would be an eligible expense.
Great. On the proposed budget, we just have a question in terms of SBA has said that as of right now that they'll allow, in terms of the budget categories, about a 10% deviation from that. Question is if we know how strict they will be on this 10%. The answer, we don't know. I don't know, Sean, if you had any other insights on that.
We know it's one of the most asked questions since they did the tutorial, and those questions have been submitted to the SBA. We were hoping to get some clarification in the last FAQ issue and or in the user guide that they're going to issue. So don't have an answer. It's a question that's come up a lot, and hope get an answer. One thing I would say in terms of listing out those expenses, something to consider is if there are things that you are going to incur, payroll, rent, those sorts of things, you may want to front load those or put the entire amount of those expenses in. And if your anticipated expenses exceed the amount that you would be eligible for as a grant, just include the most concrete expenses in the application would be one way to guard against too much deviation from the proposed budget when you apply the funds.
Thank you. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We are at 3 o'clock. Again, we thank you all for joining us for this conversation today and hope that it did provide some additional insights on the program. Sarah has also chatted in 2 additional webinars that are happening in case you want to get some more insights on this, as well as a Spanish speaking event that's coming up tonight, I believe. And so with that, Bill, if you wanted to share any closing remarks.
I just want to thank everybody for their time, both the people who are attending, but particularly the panelists. This is obviously a fairly complex application, and I think the more information we can all gather about it, the better. And let's just keep the conversation going here, and feel free to, certainly reach out to peers if you have questions. And I think, like as Sean has made clear, there's questions that have been asked that haven't fully been answered. And that's just kind of the nature of a pandemic relief program, is they're still kind of finalizing those things. So I think that the more you ask questions, the better, and as many resources and attend as many webinars as you can, and certainly look to the SBA as the final authority whenever there's a question of anything you can find there. So I thank you all for participating and for just the time you're giving to this, and for hanging in there in a tough year. For those of you who are operating venues, I hope this is actually really effective in helping you survive and recover and thrive in your communities going forward through this. And keep an eye out for future events as well, for other resources that will be coming up. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone.